He was 18 years old, with a state-issued duffel bag and a future that felt as empty as his pockets. But a key from a grandmother he barely knew would unlock a secret that had been buried for a generation. A secret that would force him to choose between a fortune and a home he never knew he had. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, listen, because we're about to find out what it means to inherit more than just a piece of land. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to be a problem for the state of Oregon. They called it aging out. It sounded like a gentle, natural process, like a fruit ripening and falling from a tree. The reality felt more like being pushed off a loading dock. My party consisted of a sheet cake from a grocery store, its frosting sweating under the fluorescent lights of the common room at the Willamette Youth Transitional Home. Brenda, my case manager for the last 2 years, stood beside it with a forced, practiced smile. She was a good person, I think, but her goodness was worn smooth by bureaucracy, eroded by 1,000 kids just like me. "Happy birthday, Leo," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the too large, too empty room. A few of the younger kids, the ones who still saw 18 as a distant, magical shore, sang a ragged version of the birthday song. I watched the flame on the single candle flicker in the draft from the air vent, a tiny, struggling point of light in a universe of beige linoleum and cinder block walls. Brenda handed me a large manila envelope. Inside was my birth certificate, my social security card, and a check for $117, the remaining balance of my state-supervised savings account. There was also a bus pass valid for 24 hours, and a list of shelters and job placement resources. It was the official starter pack for a life I had no idea how to live. "Everything's in there," she said, tapping the envelope. "Your whole life, on paper." The dry humor was unintentional, but it landed with a quiet thud in my chest. My whole life. 2 documents and $100. She then handed me the duffel bag. It was black, made of cheap nylon, and contained 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, some socks, and a toothbrush, all purchased according to state guidelines for departing wards. The bag was light. It felt far too light to carry the weight of a future. I cut the cake. The knife, a plastic one, bent under the pressure. The cake itself was dry, the frosting cloyingly sweet. I ate a piece to be polite, the sugar coating my tongue. I could feel the eyes of the other residents on me. To them, I was a ghost, a preview of their own departure. They were looking at me to see if freedom looked like hope or terror. I tried to keep my face neutral, a mask of calm I had perfected over a decade in the system. Don't show weakness. Don't show fear. Don't show anything they can use. It was the first rule you learned. I had spent so long wanting this day to come, dreaming of the moment I could walk out the door and never look back. But now that it was here, the silence on the other side of that door was deafening. The world wasn't waiting for me with open arms. It didn't even know I was coming. An hour later, I was standing outside the lawyer's office. The address had been given to me by Brenda, a final, unexpected addendum to my departure protocol. "Your grandmother's will is being read today," she'd said, her expression unreadable. "You're listed as a beneficiary. You need to be there." My grandmother, Ilara. The name was more of a whisper than a memory. I had a few faded, sepia-toned images in my mind. The smell of cinnamon and soil, the rough texture of a wool blanket, a low, humming voice. She'd been a ghost in my life long before she was an actual one. Gone from my world before I was old enough to form lasting pictures of her face. After her, there was just the system, a succession of foster homes, then the group facility. Her death a year ago had been a notice in the mail, a sterile fact. I never expected to hear her name again. The law office of Albright, Finch, and Gable was the opposite of everything I knew. The air was still and smelled of old paper, leather, and money. A thick, plush carpet swallowed the sound of my worn-out sneakers. I gave my name to the receptionist, a woman with hair like a silver helmet, and she looked me over with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and suspicion. I was acutely aware of my state-issued clothes, of the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I was a stray dog that had wandered into a cathedral. She directed me to a conference room at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-looking men. Inside, a handful of people were already seated around a massive mahogany table. They were strangers, their faces closed and unfamiliar, their clothes whispering of a comfortable, settled world. They glanced at me as I entered, a flicker of curiosity, before turning away. I was an anomaly, a loose thread in their neatly woven family tapestry. I took the only empty chair at the far end of the table, feeling like a child sitting at the grown-ups' table. Mr. Albright, a man who looked exactly like the portraits in the hall, read the will in a dry, monotonous voice. It was a litany of bequests, antique furniture to a cousin, a collection of porcelain birds to a niece, jewelry to a woman who dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. It was a glimpse into a life I had no part in. Finally, my name came up. To my grandson, Leo Vance, Albright read, peering over his glasses, whom I wish I had known better. I leave the contents of my savings account in the amount of $5,327. A check was slid across the polished surface of the table toward me. $5,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a ticket, a buffer, a small shield against the cold indifference of the world. But it also felt like a final, clean severance, a payment for a childhood I never had. The other relatives shifted in their seats, their brief interest in me already fading. The transaction was complete. I was dismissed. I took the check, folded it carefully, and put it in my pocket. I was halfway to the door, the duffel bag feeling a little heavier now, when a voice stopped me. "Mr. Vance?" It was a man I hadn't noticed before, sitting in a chair against the wall, separate from the others. He was older, with kind, tired eyes, and a suit that was well worn, but clean. He wasn't one of the family. He didn't have their scent of casual wealth. "A moment of your time?" he asked. I hesitated. The main event was over. I had what I came for. But something in his calm, steady gaze held me. I nodded. We stepped out into the hallway, away from the dispersing relatives. "My name is Samuel Davies," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was firm, dry. "I was your grandmother's personal attorney. I handled her private affairs, separate from the estate." Private affairs. The words hung in the air, imbued with a quiet significance. Mr. Albright had handled the will, the formal division of assets. Mr. Davies, it seemed, had handled the secrets. He led me to a smaller, less intimidating office. It was cluttered with books and files, a comfortable, lived-in chaos. He gestured for me to sit. "Your grandmother was a very particular woman, Leo," he began, sitting behind his desk. He used my first name, and it sounded strange, too familiar. "She had her reasons for everything she did. The arrangements with Mr. Albright's firm were a formality, a public gesture. Her true legacy for you is something else entirely." My heart began to beat a little faster. I had no idea what he was talking about. Davies reached into a drawer and pulled out two items. The first was a thick, legal-sized envelope, yellowed with age, its flap sealed with a wax stamp bearing the impression of a bird. The second was a key. It was old, made of dark, heavy iron, with an ornate clover-shaped head. It looked like something that would unlock a castle door or a pirate's chest. "This," he said, pushing the envelope across the desk, "is the deed to a property. It's fully paid for, and as of this morning, it is legally yours." He then slid the key next to it. "And this is the key to the front door." I stared at the items. A deed, a key. I picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in my palm. "A property?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What property? Where?" "It's a small homestead, a house, a barn, and about 40 acres of land," Davies said, watching me closely. "It's located in a place called Sparrow Creek, up in the coastal range." Sparrow Creek. The name meant nothing to me. I had lived my entire life within a 50-mile radius of Portland. The coastal range was a different world, a swatch of green on a map I'd never had a reason to look at. "I don't understand," I said, looking from the key to his face. "Why? Why would she leave me a house? She was never part of my life. Why wasn't this in the will?" Davies leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. The weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen. "As I said, your grandmother had her reasons. She structured things this way deliberately. She wanted this inheritance to be separate, private, just for you. She felt that it might be a burden or a temptation that you weren't ready for until you were on your own." A burden, a temptation. The words were unsettling. "What kind of burden?" I asked. He gave a small, sad smile. "The kind that comes with owning something that other people want very, very badly, Leo. The property, it's not just a piece of land. It's a story. Your grandmother wanted you to have the chance to read it for yourself, without anyone else looking over your shoulder." He stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. "My advice to you is to go there. Use the money from the will. Go to Sparrow Creek. See the place for yourself before you make any decisions. My card is in the envelope. Call me if you have questions. Or if you decide to sell." He said the last two words with a subtle lack of enthusiasm, as if it were a possibility he hoped I wouldn't consider. I left his office with a check for $5,000 in one pocket and a key to a life I never knew existed in the other. My future, which had been a blank, terrifying void an hour ago, now had a destination. Sparrow Creek. I spent that night in a cheap motel off the interstate, the kind of place where the carpets are permanently sticky and the air smells of stale smoke and despair. The $117 from the state was almost gone, spent on the room and a greasy burger from a 24-hour diner. I lay on the lumpy bed, the key and the sealed envelope on the nightstand beside me. The key seemed to hum with a strange energy, a silent invitation. The envelope felt heavy with unspoken words. I could have opened it. I could have read the deed, learned the precise location, the legal description of my inheritance. But I didn't. Mr. Davies' words echoed in my head. "It's a story. She wanted you to have the chance to read it for yourself." Reading a legal document felt like skipping to the last page of a book. I wanted to start at the beginning. The next morning, I walked to the bank and deposited the check. Seeing the number in my account balance, $5,214.38, was surreal. It was a safety net, a real one. It was the first time in my life I felt like I had options. My first option was to stay. I could get an apartment, find a job, try to build a normal life here in the city that had raised me as its ward. Or I could take the second option. I could follow this strange, posthumous breadcrumb trail my grandmother had left me. I could cash out a few $100s and get on a bus heading west. The choice felt monumental. It was the first real decision I had ever made as a free adult. Staying felt safe, predictable. Going felt like stepping off a cliff into the fog. I thought about the beige walls of the group home, the pitying look from the lawyer's receptionist, the weight of being a nobody, a file in a cabinet. Whatever was in Sparrow Creek, it was mine. It was a connection to a past, however broken. It was something. And something was infinitely more than the nothing I had. The Greyhound station was a chaotic symphony of hurried goodbyes, anxious reunions, and the weary patience of people in transit. I bought a one-way ticket to a town called Astoria, the closest major stop to the area Davies had indicated on a small map he'd tucked into the envelope. The ticket agent, a woman with a bored expression, barely looked at me. To her, I was just another person running away from something or toward something else. Maybe I was doing both. I found a seat by the window and watched the city begin to slide by. The familiar landmarks of my constrained life, the gray towers downtown, the bridges spanning the Willamette, the sprawling suburbs, receded, growing smaller and smaller until they were just a smudge on the horizon. The bus lumbered onto the highway, and the landscape began to change. The flat urban grid gave way to rolling green hills, then dense forests of Douglas fir and cedar. Patches of fog clung to the valleys, and a fine, persistent mist began to speckle the window. I leaned my head against the cool glass, the vibration of the engine a steady hum beneath me. I tried to conjure a clearer memory of my grandmother. I remembered a small apartment that always smelled of baking bread and damp wool. I remembered her hands, wrinkled and strong, showing me how to tie a knot. I remembered a song she used to hum, a tune with no words that always made me feel safe. These were just fragments, tiny shards of a life I barely got to witness. Why had she let me go? The official story, the one in my file, was neglect. But that never felt right. The woman in my fragmented memories was not a neglectful person. She was warm. She was solid. She had her reasons, Davies had said. Maybe those reasons were waiting for me at the end of this bus ride. The other passengers were a quiet, solitary bunch. A young mother with a restless toddler. An old man in a worn-out flannel shirt, staring blankly out the window. A college student with headphones on, lost in her own world. We were all strangers, sharing this temporary metal tube, each of us carrying our own stories in our own duffel bags. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outcast. I just felt like one of them, part of the anonymous flow of humanity. The sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the hills. The sky turned a bruised purple and orange. The sheer, untamed beauty of it was almost overwhelming. I had spent my life surrounded by concrete and steel, my vistas confined by buildings and fences. This wild, open space felt like a different planet. It was beautiful, but it was also intimidating. It was a world I did not know, with rules I hadn't learned. We arrived in Astoria well after dark. The bus hissed to a stop in a mostly deserted depot. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like a physical blow. It was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of salt and fish and wet earth. It was the smell of the ocean. I had never smelled the ocean before. I found a motel a few blocks from the depot, a place with a flickering neon sign that advertised color TV. The The room was small and clean, and the window looked out over the dark, churning mouth of the Columbia River, where it met the Pacific. I stood there for a long time, watching the lights of a distant ship moving slowly across the black water. I felt impossibly small, a tiny speck on the edge of a vast continent. I had followed the thread, and it had led me here, to the edge of the world. Tomorrow I would find Sparrow Creek. Tomorrow I would see what she had left me. I fell asleep to the sound of a foghorn, a low, mournful call from the darkness. The next morning I found a local taxi service, a one-man operation run by a grizzled man named Sal, who looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood. When I told him the address, or what I had of it, a road name off a rural highway, he grunted. "Sparrow Creek Road? Ain't much up there anymore. Used to be a few families. Most of 'em are gone now. You visiting someone?" His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, sharp and curious. "Something like that," I said, not wanting to explain. "Inherited a place." Sal nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "The old Vance place, then? Must be. Ain't been nobody up there in years, not since Ilara passed." He said her name with a familiar ease that startled me. He knew her. "You knew my grandmother?" I asked. "Everyone knew Ilara," he said, turning the taxi onto a two-lane highway that wound its way into the hills. "Tough woman. Kept to herself mostly, especially the last few years. Had a long-running feud with the Northwood timber guys. They wanted her land. She wasn't selling." Northwood. The name was unfamiliar, but Sal said it with a sour twist of his mouth. It sounded like an old, local grudge. The paved highway eventually turned into a gravel road, and the gravel road turned into a rutted dirt track. The forest pressed in on both sides, the branches of ancient firs interlocking overhead, creating a green, gloomy tunnel. After another mile, Sal slowed the car and pointed. "This is it. End of the line." Ahead of us was a rusted metal gate, held shut with a thick chain and a padlock. Beyond the gate, a driveway, almost completely overgrown with weeds, led into the trees. "I can't go no further," Sal said. "Driveway's probably washed out." I paid him, and he gave me his card. "You need a ride back to town, you call me. Might be no cell service up here, though. You might have to walk back to the highway." He looked at me again, a flicker of something like concern in his eyes. "You be careful, kid. That place has memories." He put the car in reverse and backed down the track, leaving me alone in the profound silence of the woods. The only sounds were the drip of water from the leaves and the distant caw of a crow. I stood before the gate, the duffel bag on the ground beside me. The chain was thick and rusty, but the padlock looked newer, more robust. I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It wasn't for this lock. This was just a barrier to keep people out. I looked around. To the right of the gate, the fence was a sagging line of rotten posts and rusted wire, easily stepped over. I left my bag by the gate and pushed my way through the thorny salmonberry bushes that had consumed the fence line. I was in. I walked up the driveway, my sneakers sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and decay. After about 100 yards, the trees opened up into a clearing. And there it was. The house was small, a simple one-story structure made of wood that had weathered to a soft silver gray. The roof of the porch sagged in the middle, and green moss grew thick on the shingles. The windows were dark and blank, like vacant eyes. To the left stood a barn, its roof partially collapsed, its red paint faded to a pale, peeling pink. The whole place seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth, being reclaimed by the relentless green of the forest. It didn't look like a home, it looked like a shipwreck. I felt a pang of disappointment. This was it? This was the grand secret? A ruin in the middle of nowhere? I walked up the creaking steps of the porch. A faded rocking chair sat in one corner, coated in a layer of green pollen and dirt. I went to the front door. The blue paint was flaking off, revealing the bare wood beneath. The lock was old and tarnished. I took a deep breath and slid the heavy iron key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. With a groan of protest from the rusty tumblers, the lock turned. The door swung inward on a single complaining hinge, opening into darkness. The air that rushed out to meet me was cold and stale, thick with the smell of dust, mice, and forgotten time. I hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside. Light filtered in through the grimy windows, illuminating a world draped in white. All the furniture was covered in white sheets, making the room look like a landscape of silent, sleeping ghosts. I pulled the sheet off the nearest shape. It was a comfortable-looking armchair, its floral pattern faded. I moved through the house, my footsteps loud in the silence, pulling back the shrouds one by one. There was a living room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and 2 small bedrooms. Everything was simple, rustic, and coated in a thick layer of dust. It was a time capsule. It looked as if someone had simply covered everything up, locked the door, and walked away. In the back bedroom, the one I assumed had been hers, a quilt with a pattern of interlocking stars was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. On the nightstand sat a pair of reading glasses and a bookmark still holding the page. It was as if she had just stepped out for a moment. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. This was her life, this quiet, solitary place. This was what she chose over me. The anger I had suppressed for so long began to bubble up, hot and bitter. Why? Why leave me to grow up in a world of strangers when she had this? As I stood there, caught in a storm of grief and rage, my foot scuffed against a floorboard. It moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. I knelt down. Most of the floorboards were flush, but this one, right beside the bed, seemed to sit just a little higher than the others. I pressed on it. It gave slightly, with a soft creak that was different from the groans of the old house. My fingers found a small crack along the edge. I pried at it. The board lifted up, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath the floor. And nestled inside that cavity was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, tied shut with a faded blue ribbon. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. This was the story. My hands were trembling as I lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked. I sat on the edge of the dusty bed and worked at the knot on the ribbon. It was tied tight, a stubborn little knot that seemed to resist me. Finally, it came loose. I lifted the lid. Inside, the first thing I saw was a stack of letters, maybe a dozen of them, tied together with another ribbon. On top of the stack was a single, smaller envelope, made of thick, creamy paper. My name was written on it in a beautiful, looping script. Leo. Just my name. My breath caught in my throat. This was from her. This was for me. I picked it up. The paper was cool and smooth. For a long moment, I just held it. The first direct communication I had ever received from my grandmother. Then, with trembling fingers, I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. I unfolded it and began to read. "My dearest Leo," the letter began. The ink was a faded blue. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found your way home. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman for the choices she made. I know you must have grown up thinking I abandoned you. I know you must hate me for it. I want you to know, from the bottom of my soul, that not a day went by that I did not think of you, that I did not ache to have you here with me. But I couldn't. It wasn't safe." The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I wiped them away impatiently and kept reading. "This land, this little piece of the world, is more than just a home. It was your grandfather's legacy, and it became my fortress. There are people, a company called Northwood Development, who want this land more than anything. They have wanted it for 30 years. Your grandfather, Michael, was a journalist. He discovered they were poisoning the land around here, dumping toxic chemicals into the creeks that feed the river. He was going to expose them. But before he could, he had an accident on the highway. I never believed it was an accident. A cold dread trickled down my spine. Northwood, the company Sal the taxi driver had mentioned. After he was gone, I became the guardian of his work, of his proof, and I became the obstacle they couldn't remove. They tried everything, Leo. Lowball offers, legal intimidation, threats both veiled and overt. They made my life a quiet, constant battle. I couldn't bring a child into that. I couldn't subject you to their tactics, to the fear I lived with every day. Putting you into the state system was the hardest thing I have ever done. It felt like cutting off a part of my own soul. I told myself it was to protect you, to give you a chance at a normal life, away from this fight. But I know it was a wound I inflicted on you, and for that, I am so sorry. I had to stop reading. A sob escaped my throat, a raw, ragged sound in the silent house. She hadn't abandoned me. She had protected me. The narrative of my life, the one I had built around the central fact of my own unworthiness, crumbled into dust. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about this land, this fight. I took a few deep, shuddering breaths and forced myself to continue reading. I have left you a choice, my boy. That's what this inheritance truly is. The world will see a rundown property and a few acres of trees. They will tell you to sell it. Northwood will likely make you an offer, a generous one. It will be enough money to start a new life anywhere you want. You could take it and walk away. No one would blame you. You owe this fight nothing. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to understand, you will find that this place is more than just dirt and wood. It is your history. It is a stand against bullies. It is a home, if you want it to be. The rest of the letters in this box will tell you the whole story. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you. Know that in my own broken way, I was always trying to bring you home. Your loving grandmother, Ilara. I read the letter again, and then a third time, the words sinking into me like rain into dry soil. The grief was still there, a vast, aching canyon in my chest. But now, it was mixed with something else. A flicker of understanding, a sense of purpose. I looked around the dusty room, at the silent, shrouded furniture. It didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a battleground. I stood up and walked out onto the porch. The sun was breaking through the clouds, sending shafts of light down through the tall firs. The air was clean and sharp. I thought about the $5,000 in my bank account. I thought about the offer Northwood would probably make. It was the easy way out, a clean break. I could take the money and run. I could buy a used car. a new wardrobe, an apartment in a city where no one knew my name. I could be free. But what was freedom? Was it the absence of responsibility? Or was it the power to choose your own responsibilities? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, walking the property line. The 40 acres were mostly dense forest, thick with undergrowth. A small creek, the Sparrow Creek, I assumed, cut through the back corner of the land. It was beautiful, wild, and untamed. It felt ancient. As dusk began to fall, I sat on the porch steps, the metal box in my lap. The temptation to sell was a siren song. It was the sensible choice, the logical one. I had been given a golden ticket out of a life of poverty and uncertainty. To turn it down would be insane. I could picture it so clearly, signing a piece of paper, the money appearing in my account. The relief, the end of the struggle. But then I pictured my grandmother, living here alone for all those years, holding on to this place, fighting this silent war for me. I pictured my grandfather, a man I'd never met, who died for trying to tell the truth. Selling this land wouldn't just be a business transaction. It would be a betrayal. It would be like selling their graves. The silence of the forest deepened as night fell. The stars came out, brilliant and cold in the black sky, more stars than I had ever seen in the city. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling I was all too familiar with. But this was different. It wasn't the loneliness of being unwanted. It was the loneliness of being at a crossroads, with no one to tell you which way to turn. The weight of the choice pressed down on me. For 18 years, my life had been decided for me. Where I lived, what I ate, what I wore. Now, I was faced with the first real choice of my life, and it was a choice that would define who I was. Was I the boy who took the money and ran? Or was I Ilara's grandson? Have you ever been faced with a choice where the easy way out felt so tempting, but you knew in your gut it wasn't the right path? A choice that felt like it would change not just your future, but who you are as a person. And I think it's important we share these stories. And if you're finding something of value here, if this story is speaking to you, please consider subscribing to for people who understand that the hardest paths often lead to the best places. Now, let's get back to that cold porch in Sparrow Creek, under a sky full of stars. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on that porch, wrapped in a dusty quilt I found in a linen closet, and I watched the moon travel across the sky. I thought about my life, a series of temporary rooms and temporary people. I had never belonged anywhere. I was always just passing through, waiting for the next placement, the next school, the next set of rules. This place, this broken-down house and tangled patch of woods, was the first thing that had ever been truly mine. And it came with a story, a history that was also mine. To sell it would be to make myself an orphan all over again, but this time by choice. Sometime before dawn, a decision settled in my heart. It wasn't a logical decision. It was a quiet, stubborn feeling that took root in the empty space where a family should have been. I wasn't going to sell, not yet. I was going to stay. I was going to read the story. The next morning, I made my choice real. I started to work. I found a broom in a closet and began to sweep. I swept the dust of years from the wooden floors, clouds of it billowing in the morning light. I swept out the dead leaves, the mouse droppings, the cobwebs. I opened every window in the house, letting the fresh, pine-scented air chase out the stale smell of time. I pulled all the sheets off the furniture and took them outside, shaking them until my arms ached. The physical labor was grounding. Each sweep of the broom, each window I unlatched, felt like an act of defiance. I was pushing back against the decay. I was claiming this place, not just with a deed, but with my own 2 hands. After I had cleaned the main living area, I turned my attention to the letters. I sat in the newly uncovered armchair, the metal box on the floor beside me, and I untied the ribbon. The letters were from a man named Ben. His correspondence with my grandmother spanned almost 20 years. He was, I gathered, a former geologist for Northwood who had quit in disgust. He was her inside source, her confidant. He was the one who had helped her gather the proof. I read for hours, piecing together the sordid history. Northwood wasn't just a timber company. They had a chemical division, and for decades they had used the vast, sparsely populated forests as their private dumping ground. The Vance property, as they called it, was strategically important because its creek, Sparrow Creek, was one of the few in the area that remained uncontaminated. My grandmother's land was the control group in their sick experiment. Her refusal to sell was more than just a nuisance. It was a standing testament to their guilt. If her land was clean, it proved the contamination on the surrounding properties was not natural. As I was sifting through the last of the letters, my fingers brushed against a false bottom in the metal box. I lifted it out. Beneath it lay another set of documents. These weren't letters. They were copies of internal Northwood memos, geological surveys with falsified data, and lab reports showing dangerously high levels of toxins in soil samples from neighboring lands. And at the very bottom was a small, leather-bound ledger. I opened it. It was my grandfather's. His neat, precise handwriting detailed dates, locations, and eyewitness accounts. It was his investigation. It was the evidence that had gotten him killed. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a folded map. It was a topographical map of the entire region. My grandfather had marked a dozen locations on it with a red X, and on the back, a handwritten note. They bury their sins, Ilara, but if you know where to dig, the earth doesn't lie. I realized with a jolt what I was holding. This wasn't just the story of the crime. This was the proof. This was the weapon my grandmother had been sharpening for 30 years. I was so absorbed in the contents of the box that I didn't hear the car until it was already coming up the driveway. The sound of an engine was an intrusion, a violation of the deep silence I had grown accustomed to. I quickly put the ledger and the map back in the box and slid it under the armchair. I went to the window and peered out. A sleek black sedan, impossibly clean against the backdrop of the wild woods, was parked behind Sal's old taxi, which I'd called back to bring me supplies. A man in a sharp, expensive-looking suit got out. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked completely out of place, like a wolf in a tailored suit. He walked up to the porch and knocked on the doorframe. "Hello?" he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Mr. Vance? Leo Vance?" I took a breath, my heart pounding, and opened the door. "I'm Leo," I said. "A pleasure to meet you," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm and cool. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm with the Acquisitions Department at Northwood Development." So the wolf had come to the door. "We were sorry to hear about your grandmother's passing," he said, his tone dripping with synthetic sympathy. "She was a fixture in this community." He glanced around at the clearing, at the dilapidated barn and the overgrown yard. "We've been interested in acquiring this parcel for some time. For conservation purposes, of course. We'd like to see it returned to its natural state." The lie was so bald-faced, so audacious, it almost made me laugh. He wanted to return it to its natural state by burying it in poison. "I know this is all very new to you," he continued, "so I'll be direct. Northwood is prepared to offer you $750,000 for the house and the 40 acres, as is." The number hung in the air between us. $750,000. It was an astronomical sum. It was not just a new life. It was a new universe. I could feel the pull of it, the gravitational force of that much money. All my problems solved. All my fears erased. All I had to do was sign a paper, say yes. "That's a very generous offer," Thorne said, mistaking my silence for consideration. "It would set you up for life. No more worries." He handed me a glossy folder. "The offer is detailed in here. We can have the funds transferred to your account within 48 hours of you signing." He gave me another one of his empty smiles. "Of course, the offer is only on the table for a limited time. And I should mention, if we can't come to an agreement, there are other avenues. Eminent domain for public access trails, that sort of thing. It gets messy, expensive for you. We'd prefer to handle this amicably." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of corporate politeness. "Take the money, or we will crush you." He left his card on top of the folder and walked back to his car, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel I'd had Sal deliver. I watched him drive away, a black shark disappearing back into the green depths of the forest. I stood there on the porch, the folder in my hand. It felt heavy, toxic. I opened it. The contract was inside, along with a cashier's check for the full amount, post-dated. All it needed was my signature. $750,000. I walked back inside and sat down in the armchair. I looked at the clean floor, at the sunlight streaming through the windows I had washed. I thought about the choice my grandmother had given me. "You owe this fight nothing," she had written. But she was wrong. I owed it to her. I owed it to the grandfather I never knew. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I owed something to myself. I owed it to myself to be someone who didn't run. I picked up the ledger and the map from the box. This was my inheritance. Not the land, not the money. This. This was a legacy of courage, of stubborn integrity in the face of greed. My grandmother had spent her life as a guardian, a lonely sentinel. She hadn't passed the property to me as a burden, but as a baton. She was giving me the chance to finish the race. For my entire life, I had been defined by what I lacked: a family, a home, a history. I was a blank page, a file in a cabinet. But here, in this dusty house, I had found my story. It was a difficult, painful story, but it was mine. I realized that home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you choose to fight for. This run-down house, this patch of wild forest, this quiet creek, it was the only home I had ever known. I walked into the small kitchen and found the wood-burning stove. It was cold and filled with old ashes. I crumpled up the Northwood offer, the contract, the glossy pages promising a life of ease. I stuffed them inside the stove, on top of the old ashes. Then I took a match from a box on the mantelpiece, struck it, and lit the corner of the paper. The flame caught, bright and hungry. I watched the words, $750,000, curl up, turn black, and disappear into smoke. It was the easiest decision I had ever made. I picked up my phone. I had one bar of service, flickering in and out. It was enough. I dialed the number on the business card Mr. Davies had given me. He answered on the second ring. "Davies?" His voice was calm and steady. "It's Leo Vance," I said. "I'm at the property." "Leo," he said, a note of warmth in his voice. "I was hoping I'd hear from you. Did you get a visit from Mr. Thorne?" "He just left," I said, watching the last of the contract burn. He made an offer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "And?" Davies asked, his voice neutral. "And I told him I'd think about it," I lied. "Mr. Davies, I'm not selling. I want to fight them." The silence on the line was different this time. It was filled with something that felt like relief. "I was hoping you'd say that, Leo," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I really was. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She prepared for this. She didn't want to force your hand, but she made provisions. She left a separate trust, not a large one, but enough to get started, enough for the legal fight. It was only to be accessed if you made this choice on your own. A final gift, a final act of faith. She had provided the shield, but I had to be the one to pick it up. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. There would be lawyers and injunctions and a long, hard battle against a wealthy, ruthless corporation. But as I stood there in that dusty house, with my grandfather's map in my hand and my grandmother's courage in my heart, I didn't feel scared. For the first time in my entire life, I felt strong. I was no longer a ward of the state. I was the guardian of Sparrow Creek. I was home. My story in Sparrow Creek was really just beginning that day. It was the start of a long, messy, and difficult fight. But it was a fight I had chosen. It was my fight. Sometimes the greatest gifts we receive aren't the easy ones. They don't come in neat packages or with simple instructions. The most meaningful inheritances are the ones that ask something of us, the ones that challenge us to be better, stronger, and braver than we ever thought we could be. They give us a reason to stand for something. What about you? What's the most meaningful inheritance you've ever received? It doesn't have to be money or property. It could be a piece of advice, a story, a value, a responsibility. Tell me your story, and if these stories of finding our way, of choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, and become part of this community.